information, such data. We also work with private stakeholders, and we need to perform due diligence and understand that our private stakeholders who give us access to such information or that work on such information and to provide us with the insights are diligent in their work, and they collect data in the first place legitimately and fairly. So as Marcin has mentioned, to include the process, to build trust, we need to make sure that the process is inclusive and transparent. For these purposes, we have a privacy advisory group, and actually a few members here of our privacy advisory group are on this panel as well. It's Rohan, Danilo, and Marcin, and Radisha Madhub, the data protection commissioner who is participating remotely, is also part of our privacy advisory group. The topic of the panel is risks and utility. So the main question in our work is to actually understand how we can mitigate risks. And one of the questions that we usually ask us is, what is the risk of not using the data? And that's what we are trying, that's what I would like you to think about as well. We have the risks and harms that could be caused by the uses of big data, but we need to also think of what are the risks when we're not using such data and how such risks could be mitigated. This is a project that we conducted with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to specifically understand how legitimate purpose, justified purpose, and principle of proportionality could be used and applied in big data applications when it comes to humanitarian and development response. On the map, the objective of the project was to understand what is the level of detail that you need in call detail records to achieve the objective of your mission? How much information do you need in order to understand how people, for example, are moving during the disaster response and not yet to lose that utility while still protecting privacy? And the idea, and actually what the project has shown is that while there are risks of re-identification if you aggregate data, let's say by zip code or by municipality, of course the risks increase for re-identification the smaller area there is. However, the utility does not always decreases, and it highly depends on the context. So for these purposes, I think what is important to know is that we need to understand what is the right threshold, how the threshold should be mitigated with the risk of using big data versus not using such data, and there is a need for awareness of bringing such points to the public stakeholders and private stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Rohan, please.
Good morning. Next. Okay. Thanks. I come from an organization which describes itself, as you may see there, as pro-poor, pro-market. Everything that we do has to have implications for not only for the rich in society. So when we were looking at, from 2012, I've been part of a team of data scientists, domain experts, actually doing big data, conceptualizing and executing big data research in the global south. We may be the only entity that fits this criteria. We looked at what were the comprehensive data sets. So these are some of the countries that we work in. And you can see that even when the last column, this would be on your left, is Facebook users per 100, where, for example, Thailand has 49 Facebook users per 100 people, but still that is below 50%. Whereas the first column, which is mobile SIMs per 100, you see that even in Myanmar, which basically started getting into ICT connectivity this year in 2014, 2015, the number is already at 50 per 100. So to us, it was not a question as to what data sets we would work with, which included the poor, and that is mobile SIMs, mobile network data. So we are not relying on smartphone data or anything like that, but just mobile network data, which is generated by even the simplest phone. So when we look at our data, we don't think that the mobile data by itself can give all the answers, though some of the answers For example, because it tracks how people move through time and space, it gives incredible insights in terms of traffic management and urban development, and those are the slides that I'm going to show to you. But in the other cases, we are working with the statistical officers and various other entities to supplement, to validate, and to cross-check these data sources. We work only with pseudonymized data, and we cover about 60% of the population that we are working with in the areas that we report our results from multiple mobile operators, so that even which operator it comes from cannot be figured out. Some of the things that we do will obviously, what we are interested in is things that have public implications for public purposes, to see whether public policies are working, things of that nature, that to allow even policy experimentation. But we do understand that there are some of these things that are dual use, where they could also be used for private purposes. What you see before you is a temporal mapping of how people move. We take where they are located at midnight as their home location, and the blue areas show where, so the top middle is a weekday noon time slot, collapsed over multiple months, where we show where people have left, that is the density has decreased, where those areas serve as sources, and the red and the yellow are the sinks where they have moved to. So this is quite useful for urban planning and traffic management kinds of issues. And we have cross-checked it against conventional transport studies. Ours costs, even if we put all the hardware costs in, etc., would be less than $30,000. The other study that is done every 3-4 years costs $300,000 or $400,000. And ours can be done every 15 minutes if one wishes. We also have been looking at things where we don't really need to know anything about the individuals. It's just the loading factors, how much traffic is carried on base stations. The two sort of profiles here, one is for a commercial area, because you can see that the weekend and weekday behaviors are very different, fundamentally different. The weekends are the blues and the greens, and the other one where there's no big difference between weekday and weekend, and the peak is about 7 p.m., whereas in the other one the peak is at about 12. So from this we are able to identify where, so you have three figures here for the the city of Colombo, and two of the figures are the official planning maps which show what land use is, and ours shows that quite a lot of the areas that were demarcated as being residential have already converted to commercial according to these signatures. There are lots more, but given time constraints, I will just give you a flavor of the kind of work that can be done. We do understand that these are data that is generated by competitive suppliers. There are competition issues involved here. There's obviously, when you talk about data, even pseudonymized, even historical, of people moving through time and space, and which sort of the metadata of who they call or are called by. There are significant harms that could come, marginalization harms of not being included in the data sets at all, and therefore being ignored by public policy. Competition harms in the sense of implications for small companies, new entrants, as against those who already have the data. And finally, what are generally called privacy harms, which is a rather undefined category, because there are many things that come under the heading of privacy. But we have gone through and looked at all the harms that could be caused, and we are working with the data suppliers to develop language that will specifically address the harms and will therefore reduce the transaction costs of sharing this data. We're also working with them on simplifying the pseudonymization processes, because it does take a lot of their computing resources. So I'll leave it at that for an introduction.
Thank you so much, Natasha.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm Natasha Jackson, and I work for the GSMA, which is the Global Association for Mobile Phone Operators. So all the mobile phone operators, around 850 of them around the world, are members of ours. So we have looked at big data also from an Internet of Things perspective, but increasingly are looking at it from the socioeconomic perspective. And we have recognized, as we've heard before on the panel, all of the socioeconomic benefits that can be derived from it. We have a number of members who've used CDRs and others to better understand, particularly around spreads of diseases. And I have a few examples on a slide here of some of our operators who've worked on these issues. Back in 2013, Orange, part of France Telecom, worked in the Ivory Coast looking at the spread of malaria. Telefonica have done similar work in Mexico on swine flu, and Telenor recently in Pakistan looked at the spread of dengue. But there are other studies that they've looked into, such as mapping population density, things similar to what Rohan described, and also predictions for crime hotspots in different localities. And Millicom, also up there, has also now developed a partnership with Flowminder to look particularly at health across all of their territories that they operate in. So that would be with sort of local authorities. They would then work with ministries, health ministries and other agencies. So, I mean, as more and more people are using mobile phones and their data can potentially become more revealing about them, really the important issue around privacy has come up. And this is something that the GSMA has taken very seriously for a while in a general sense. We developed and started working on privacy issues back in 2011 when we developed a set of mobile privacy principles, and these govern how we believe that mobile privacy should be respected by mobile operators and others in the ecosystem at a very high level, so top-level principles. We then developed those further into looking in specific areas such as app privacy and how apps should handle data. All of these are available on our website, gsma.com, if you're interested. But then back last year in 2014, we worked specifically on Ebola and looking at the response to the countries affected and how the mobile operators could help there through the provision of big data. So we worked with both data scientists and our operators in those countries during the crisis to develop a set of guidelines that would really guide how the data could be accessed and how it would be used. And one of the principal reasons of this was also to reassure the local governments that these privacy risks and implications had been thought about up front before any of this work started. One of the fundamental principles that we have in the guidelines is that the CDR data will never leave the custody of the mobile operators, and the mobile operators are very strong on this particular issue. So, for example, Telenor in Pakistan followed the same guidelines and made sure that any analysis of the data was done on their own premises in the country, and that data did not leave it. It could only accessed, as part of the guidelines, data would only be accessed by authorized personnel. There would be an auditable process of who had access to the data at the time. And the analysis of the data itself was also only performed on the premises and under the operator supervision at all time and only by approved research agencies. So it was only really the aggregated data, the maps and the statistics that would then leave the mobile operator's custody, and those would be to approved third parties and under sort of legal contracts. In terms of what we learned from the Ebola experience last year, I mean, one of the key issues that came up was this ambiguity in the law, particularly around telecoms data. So when we think of privacy, we tend to think about data protection rules, but in many countries those rules may not exist or there may not be omnibus data protection laws. And there are also many obligations on telecoms operators under their license conditions or other telecom-specific rules, and these may not apply to other entities, but they will apply there. So in the Ebola case, for example, the laws may, in the countries, there was more than one country involved, but the laws may not explicitly allow the use of big data in this, or personal data in this sense. But there were certainly penalties there that would be imposed on the operators if any data confidentiality was breached at all. So they were very nervous about some of those conditions that they had those. So this ambiguity in law could be a disincentive to mobile operators. The other thing we learned from Ebola was that we don't necessarily have all the skills or the local capacity in the countries where the data resides. And if you're only processing on those premises, you need to have those skills there. So building up local capacity is very important. And the other challenges we had was around, not necessarily on Ebola, but generally competing agencies and research agencies. How do you know and how do you judge which research entity has addressed privacy risks, or which agency is going to be the lead agency? So sort of in conclusion, our takeouts are that, of course, we always have to consider the risks of the data and take a risk-based approach right from the beginning and before doing any of the work. We need to think about the way that the data might be privacy impactful or harmful, both for individuals and for groups or communities of people. We need to think very carefully about the regulations and in new regulations in particular, make sure that there's nothing in there that will preclude the use of big data in the future, because we don't know how we may want to use some of this big data, what the use cases may be. And one of the ways that we might look at that is by establishing a sort of public good interest in new data protection regulations and laws. And this particularly, I think, could incentivize mobile operators who haven't worked in this area, and especially those who are in countries where there are ambiguities in law and they're worried about some of the penalties that they have under general telecoms regulations. And of course, we need really clear rules and methodologies for data rules. So there are these guidelines that we developed, others that Mila talked about before, and we need to work on them all together. So whether that's company, chief privacy officers, data scientists, regulators, policymakers, and civil societies, we need to work on those together, because if we don't develop a set of rules and guidelines that people can trust, then there will be increasingly concerns and scrutiny by regulators over what we do in this area, and that is the risk, that we don't use the opportunities that big data can provide. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Danilo?
Thank you. Good morning. I'll talk now from a perspective which is slightly different than the other one, from the data controller's perspective, from data user's perspective. I'll talk from a regulator's perspective on data protection. I've worked for several years in the Ministry of Justice in Brazil, and now I'm currently a counselor to the Ministry of Justice on data protection issues. And as many of you may be aware, here in Brazil we don't have general data protection regulation. There is a pending regulation, there is a proposal which has been drawn by the Minister of Justice on data protection law. There are some proposals on the Congress, but currently you only have some pieces, some slices of regulations in some sectors. We have the consumer law, we have the Internet Bill of Rights, Marco Civil Internet, but the first question, and taking a bit of the speech made by Natasha, is what is the panorama of a country without data protection regulation, and would it need to several big data use? Is it good not to have a general regulation on data protection? On the one side, some may think that is interesting not to have major regulatory obstacles on using big data, but that is much more of a wishful thinking than other thing, because if you are not sure what are your boundaries when dealing with personal data, with aggregated data, there may be no clear nor concrete legal basis for the personal data treatment. There will be no legal certainty. There will be a situation where responsible players may not have the incentive to use big data in favor of other players who are not so, let's say, maybe not so fairly. What is the situation of Brazil right now? For instance, take the purpose principle, which is capital for big data use, for secondary use of data, and so on. The purpose principle is not present in any general statute in Brazil. The purpose principle is mentioned in a credit law. It's present on the Marco Civil Internet, the Internet Bill of Rights, but not maybe in a very direct way. But something that would be similar to the purpose principle can be interpreted from the consumer law, from the Constitution. So it's very hard to say if secondary use of personal data, even for public interest, will be deemed legal under trial circumstances right now. Let's take, for instance, what happens when, let's say, traditional big data product is released in Brazil. We had a major telecom operator who, 1 or 2 years, 1 year ago, more or less, launched a project using aggregated geolocational data to sell reports of flux of people in urban areas and so on. That called the attention of some organs in government who asked for how it was done. Was it transparent for mobile phone users? Do the telecom operator collected their consent, their prior consent? The consent was included in contract with the operator, and so it caused the telecom operator to redefine. It seems that the telecom operator postponed for 1 year, more or less, the launch of the product, and until now it is under current investigation, which maybe is not easy for the data users, but it's not an easy task for the regulator, which seems that some boundaries of big data use are not clear, and the regulator has to deal with people's rights and expectancies, and also with the fact that some public interest use may be deemed illegal in some occasions because of uncertainty of the lack of a real legal basis. In the proposal of data protection regulation, which was drafted by the Minister of Justice, there are some points on which you can form a prior legal basis for big data usage, which is mainly, among others, the legitimate interest of data controllers, but also the exception for the public interest, which are all exceptions for the requirement of consent. And it can form, it's not only exceptions, but they are fundaments for that justify the treatment of personal data. I believe that these questions, these issues, can be taken must be taken in consideration together with the issue of consent, which is maybe a bit anachronical when it seems to be anachronical sometimes when we deal with big data, but we believe consent can have and will have a role on big data in some occasions, and I wish to talk about this a bit more later.
Thank you. Lorenzo, please.
Good morning. First of all, thank you very much for the organizer to invite Telecom Italia to this workshop. I believe that the importance of mobile communication on development has been well established in terms of impact on GDP and so on. All of us, we know very well this expression, like now croppers farmer can have information on weather, price of crops directly through the phone. But probably now we start to realize that we don't have anymore only phone, but each user with a diffusion of smartphone has a computer on its end. And this is a totally, completely new ball game. It's extremely, there is a great potential, especially because innovation, digital innovation, it's a combinatory. In other words, it's not just based on a big new innovation, but it's a combination of existing piece of innovation. And having a smartphone in our hands means that there is a lot that can be done. Big data is an application of that. And so it's important to look at the potential for development of big data. Telecom Italia promote the development of big data, and we have done ad hoc initiative to do that. This is what I will be talking about today. we have promoted what we call Big Data Challenge. In other words, we promote a competition, a contest on open innovation that put in touch big data owners with academic and industrial professionals that have the competence to exploit this big data. In other words, we collect, this competition collect innovative big data projects that represent a business opportunity in the short and medium term. The edition 2015 was called Big Data for Competitive Boost. We had about 1,100 participants from more than 20 countries. We examined more than 100 high-value projects, and this project basically were using data from 7 Italian large cities, 2 months of data, more than 100 gigabytes of data. This data, of course, this is important for the issue that were mentioned before, were heterogeneous and anonymized, anonymous operational big data. So the participants have data from energy consumption, car GPS position, car accident statistics, mobile network, so traffic, census data, and company information. And they developed a bunch of projects. They kept, of course, the intellectual property on the idea that were presented. There were 2 tracks of project. The academic track for advanced, highly innovative solution. The target were student, research, academic teams. And then there was an industrial track for market-ready solution. Target small and medium enterprise, startup, and venture capital teams. There was a special committee of industry and academic distinguished personalities that select the winning idea. And the best project got a prize of 10,000 euro. Like I said before, the company, the data set were coming from different companies like TIM, the National Statistic Institute in Italy, insurance company, Twitter for social network, and so on. They had also university from abroad, like MIT or other universities, that participated to this contest. And I think it was a quite successful initiative. It probably should be replicated everywhere, because it's a way of allowing, to some extent, the matching of demand and supply of using of big data. A couple of comments on additional issues. I think that from what I understand and I believe, big data can play an important role, for instance, in making more resilient the smart cities. Smart cities, traditionally smart cities have been considered like a way of offering digital services, okay? But I think to make them more resilient, we should use the big data available from the offering of these services to have a better governance of these cities. And so here comes the issue of how we use the big data, how the data set talk to each other, and so how we open this data, how we create standard, how we make interoperable platform to do that. And I think we should also make clear that data, we should follow some clear rule. Basically, data can be considered under 3 conditions. We have personal data, common interest data, and also data that can be offered for open monetization. I think for the first category, we should follow, the rules of data protection that each country is developing. Common interests are data that should be made completely anonymized, but they should be made available, because will allow will allow the development of new services. And the third category, there are also data can be offered for open monetization because there is a market for that, as long as there are clear rules on how to use it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we have our remote participant, Drudisha. So hopefully she will appear on the screen.
Yes, hello. Good morning. Thank you for having invited me to participate
When
in this
Drudisha
panel
has
today.
presented her input to this panel, there will be room for questions from the floor. So please try also to prepare for questions that are brief, on target, and not too long in time-wise. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try. Thank you. So, can I start the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so I will focus my introduction on big data challenges and try to bring some recommendations for a healthy use of big data in a developmental context. The question is, how do we analyze and quantify what is still unknown with big data in a developmental context? This is, I think, a big challenge because the data often relied on is gathered from mainly external sources, either public or private. So we must really work towards closing the divide between what is and what could be the possible harms and risks to people. I'm confident that UN Global Pulse is handling these challenges, but I'm not confident on the quality of big data that we now have on a large scale. For me, the challenge is how to decipher between reliable and non-reliable data. So we're dealing with a situation where at the source, the data may be potentially corrupt, and we need to adopt preventive and predictive techniques which will seriously allow the detection of such anomalies even before any particular use of that data. There are obviously undeniable benefits to be derived from good quality big data, but the lack of data protection regulations, more in developing countries than in developed countries, is also a big concern in a developmental context. In order to overcome barriers related to big data adoption, policymakers should ensure various enabling conditions for the creation, availability, and use of data. The lack of big data related skills and competency also underscores the importance of moving the focus beyond the numbers of technological devices to the strengthening of national or international technological capacity to use big data. Collaboration and cooperation among stakeholders is thus essential to foster the proper data ecosystem for development. The value of information no longer resides solely in the primary purpose of big data. It is now in secondary uses that big data is put to. Strikingly, in this big data age, most innovative secondary uses haven't yet been imagined when the data was first collected. So how can individuals give informed consent to the unknown? The alternative is also, which is asking users to agree to any possible future use of their data at the time of collection. But I don't think this is too helpful. Such a wholesale permission emasculates the very notion of informed consent. In the context of big data, the tried and trusted concept of notice and consent is often either too restrictive to unearth data's latent value or too empty to protect individuals' privacy. If everyone's information is in a data set, even choosing to opt out may leave a trace. Let's take Google Street View. Unfortunately, big data, with its increase in the quantity and variety of information, facilitates also re-identification. So what is to be done? We should envision a different privacy framework for the big data age. One focused less on individual consent at the time of collection and more on holding data users accountable for what they do. Running a formal big data use assessment, such as a PIA, a privacy impact assessment, correctly and implementing its findings accurately offers tangible benefits to data users. They will be free to pursue secondary uses of personal data in many instances without having to go back to individuals to get their explicit consent. On the other hand, sloppy assessments or poor implementation of safeguards will expose data users to legal liability and regulatory actions. So data user accountability only works when it has teeth also. Shifting the burden of responsibility from the public to the users of data makes sense for a number of reasons. They know much more than anybody else, and certainly more than data subjects or regulators, about how they intend to use the data. By conducting PIAs, for example, they will avoid the problem of revealing confidential strategies to outsiders. Perhaps most important, the data users reap most of the benefits of secondary use. So it's only fair to hold them accountable for their actions and place the burden for this review on them. I will go straight, because it's just an introduction, I don't have too much time, on what I think is my main recommendation going to be. There is a big need for international guidelines, policies, rules on big data. It's a must to ensure that all countries can speak the same language on a same parity level. Otherwise, this digital divide may lead to further multiple and different uses of the same data depending on the context which it is being used in. And this is quite dangerous, because it is actually making that data something which it wasn't meant for. So this is my small conclusion to the introduction. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and please stay with us, Rudisha. Before letting the audience in, I actually have a question for Rudisha, so if we could get her back on the screen. Thank you. Are you with us, Rudisha? So, can you hear me, Rudisha? Sorry.
Yes, I can
Yes,
hear
great.
you.
So you began your presentation with discussing the possibility that the data actually also could be corrupt. So I have just a quick follow-up question on that. I mean, how can we harness the trust issues in this long chain of actors, from data collectors to data brokers to users and governments as well? Do you have any ideas on that?
Well, actually, it's actually a very long chain. That's the issue. The longer the chain, the more the potential that the data maybe actually get corrupt in the process. So what was initially collected may have been, let's say, anonymized at one point in time, and then re-identified as far as it is possible, and then we give a different perspective to that data. And this is the risk that the individual runs, because the data is taking so many forms and so many dimensions that the individual himself is not aware of. And we actually don't really inform him of the multiple, let's say, facets that the data has taken. So in this sense, this data, which initially belonged to the individual, no longer actually belongs to him, because it is something which has completely changed. So how far are we being realistic with the use of data? Let's not say only big data, but data itself, because this is the data that will rely in a big data context. So how far are we being realistic, and how far are we being accurate, and how far are we really putting the focus on the quality of the data that we are dealing with? So I think this is what I would like to say on that.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience in the room? And please stay with us, Rudisha, throughout the session.
Yes, thank you.
Apparently, I need to run with the mic, so I will do that. Please.
Thank you. I'm Parminder from IT for Change, a based organization Globe. I think there have been a couple of issues here. One is the value of big data, which was demonstrated in how it is valuable increasingly for development, and that we would agree. And second is the harm it may do in terms of privacy, and we are talking about it. But there's a third political economy question about who benefits from the value of that data. which discussion I think has not quite started. Now, like Rohan is working on big data sets, which he gets from the telephone operators, which they may be sharing it now, but I also heard Telephone Italia talk about big data for competitive advantage, and of course they are going to soon realize that that's one of the biggest resource they hold. And at that point, the question is that data which has been collected from the people, I don't think they'll keep on giving it free for whatever may be called public use. So who determines the ownership and who gets the value of the data which is collected by the people? So what's the political economy of data? That has to connect to the privacy issues around data. Just a comment, and I would like to hear your views on it.
Thank you.
I have to say, I mean, I'm not an expert in privacy protection, but the kind of breakdown that I did, you know, this idea of having basically private personal data, okay, common interest data and data offered for open monetization. No, I think we made it clear what are the ambit of what you say. In other words, create some market for, okay, for the three products. Let's put it this way. Personal data, of course, if you don't have a consent, you cannot use. I mean, you have to follow the rules of the country related to data protection. So of course, if the consumer does not give you the authorization to do it, you cannot use it. Then there are the common interest data. This, as long as they're anonymized, you know, like I don't think that, for instance, I think there is a general benefit if I know what are the flow of, in the morning of traffic going from one point data A to data B. And so here there is all this bunch of, for instance, there are recommendations from the OECD on using public sector information. This becomes public sector information that can be used here. So maybe the government can offer this data, made available, and then the private sector can create the service for. Okay, and then there is the third area. Maybe we should understand better what can mean, you know, the offer for open monetization, but there is also there can be a market for that too.
Thank you. We have a number of questions from now. We have one there first, and then we have there. So we have a number, but we do also have a gender bias in the question, people asking questions. So actually, if there's a woman also wanting to have a question, I will put that forward between the guys that are now in line. But please, if you begin.
Hi there, I'm Rodrigo from Dynamo Brazil. As Rudisha said, one of my concerns is also on the privacy of what we consider today what's anonymous data. So I just want to give some information for you guys. I work with innovation and startups, and Microsoft released 2 years ago a paper doing research on big data collected for the gyroscopes from the cell phones. So it could generate with information that they collected from the phones that everybody has, like a fingerprint of usage. So data that was collected for usage of other things was reused by Microsoft to generate a fingerprint of this data, and made like if you got my phone and used it, Microsoft would know that who was using my phone wasn't me, it was you, just by using the phone, using it in your pocket and walking around. So how do you treat what we consider today anonymous data in the future? How does regulation treat that so we can be secure that what we gave the data for is not being used for another thing? Thank you.
Thank you. Any answers to the question?
I have a response to the previous question as well. Would you prefer that we collect some questions and then we answer, or do you want me to go one by one?
We could do that as well. We have a remote question to begin with, though, because we need to let the internet in as well. If it works.
So thank you. My first question is for the Asia and for India, for China, and the like companies presentation. So it's just related to users' mobility for traffic management. So is that achievable, for example, taking the GPS trajectories of every user's movement in the city, and how we can know the user's behavior in such situation? How we can identify user's behavior, for example, maybe my navigation and the other person navigation may be sometimes different, and that's also difficult for privacy issue. And the other question for the whole experts, when you come to big data management nowadays, there are a lot of money running on big data management because telecom companies and internet companies, they are made a lot of data on that project. Yeah, they are making a lot of money. So when I came to this, they are using all my full data. I don't have any income because I'm paid for the internet, but they are using my data. They are selling my data. So what is the future direction for perspectives of users of telecom companies and users of internet companies? Are they going to participate in the research? Are they going to be, just getting some feedback or getting some income? Are they going to know who is using their data rightly? Yeah? Because they are not telling who is selling or who is buying their data. Thank you.
Thank you. Was it possible to get a question from remote?
Yes, thank you, Chair. We have a question from Pat Walsh from the United Kingdom, and he asks, in times of humanitarian crisis, people move across borders. Their data moves with them. How do we ensure protection across borders?
Good. We have a question in the middle here as well. You in the white shirt. Yes.
Thank you. I would like to start by saying that, in my opinion, data is not relevant for itself. I don't think you have to differ less or more relevant data. You can turn data, irrelevant data, in relevant data by just crossing over databases, you know. So you say in privacy issues that transparency can solve this. But can't we think that transparency can be misdirected too? Like we can influence people to give data and saying that you're going to use for some stuff, and then we just cross over with another database and use for other stuff. Can you understand what I'm saying? So do you think that transparency is enough for the privacy issues of big data?
Thank you. I think that we have 3 more questions waiting to be asked. So there, and there, and there as well. And then we will go to answering the questions.
Thank you. I'm Derek Cogburn from American University. I just wanted to follow up on a question, I think it was the first question in the room, is as we develop principles related to big data, I think that we need to pay particularly close attention to the potential for de-anonymization of data. Particularly as we aggregate data from multiple sources, it becomes possible to, I mean, there have been lots of studies that have shown how it's possible to identify persons in data that were previously thought to be anonymous or de-identified. And I think that is a particular problem as we start to aggregate data from multiple sources. So as you develop the principles, I think, Mila, you talked a lot about that. I think that's something that we have to consider.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Mario from the ITS, Institute for Technology and Society of Rio de Janeiro. I would like to follow up on one question. The remote lead made the question on the issue of cross-border. You all mentioned that big data is becoming a really important asset for humanitarian action. And I see a problem here, or at least a need to discuss this cross-border issue on humanitarian action, especially, let's say, getting some ideas on Natasha's comments of consistency and the need to, let's say, to harmonize rules. And here in the case of humanitarian action, we have different stakeholders processing data, exchanging data. So we have the private sector, civil society, industry, national governments, and let's say, I could add a different actor, which is international organizations. And then we see that international organizations are not subject to national laws on data protection. How could you think of addressing this issue of international organizations as data controllers? And should we discuss at least a minimum set of rules for the processing of data, especially considering the role international organizations play in humanitarian action, maybe a kind of international agreement or a regulation for the UN system? So that's my point here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Stefan Verhulst, the Governance Lab, GovLab at NYU. So I have a question with regard to the data value chain, meaning to a large extent sometimes data is being discussed as a thing, and then ultimately, of course, data only gets value through a process. And so there are a variety of decision points through the process that are being made that either can increase the value but also can increase the harm. And it was already mentioned, one element was, of course, quality, but there are many other elements that are affected because data is to a large extent the process. So how do you deal with that from a data governance point of view?
Thank you so much for the good questions. A lot of questions are discussing the issues of borders, physical borders or database borders, for instance. Natasha, could I direct that question to you maybe, as you are working with so many actors in so many countries?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the issue of cross-border data is not just in big data. We struggle with this, and our group companies, for example, struggle on this where they work across regions. Obviously, in Europe, those issues are getting addressed by the GDPR, but in places like Asia and others. I think one of the key issues here is the fact that there are so many multiple parties involved. So we need to really involve telecoms regulators as well, and that's really important in terms of capacity building, because a lot of the regulators in some countries may not have thought of these, and in some places equally the opportunities that could be used by these data haven't really been understood and sort of distilled into the thought process that much. So a lot of people are thinking about locking down the data in the barriers rather than thinking about the opportunities it can prevent. And then we need to get those telecoms regulators together with data protection authorities together. So there's quite a lot of sort of upfront work that needs to do just in order to start the discussions on them. And that needs to be the first thing. And actually it's events like this and some of the capacity building that GSMA does on these issues that's really important as a stepping stone.
Thank you so much. Juan, please.
The most important things that I would like to emphasize is that before we make rules, before we try to legislate about this subject, we should try to understand what is actually going on. So, for example, abstractly, you can talk about data crossing borders and being matched and leaving government control. In actual fact, in some countries, you have international gateway operators. That means that those particular CDRs do not show what the B number or the called number on the other side is. All you get is a tandem switch or an international operator's code. You are receiving the data from the operators pseudonymized. That is, before it leaves the operator's premises, it is pseudonymized. So the script that has been run on data in country A or for operator A will give a certain set of random numbers. When I said pseudonymized, it means that the same random string will be associated with a particular caller over time. But that particular caller's number in another network in the custody of another operator, or on the other side of a tandem switch or an international gateway, cannot be connected at all because the pseudonymization script that is run on the other side is completely different. So, for example, we would like to know what the international calling patterns of our customer, the data set that we have, but we can't. Now, people can sit in rooms and legislate about things that really cannot be done on the ground. So that is why I think it's a very, very important thing for lawyers who like to make up rules for imagined scenarios to actually talk to the researchers who are doing the research. And for the researchers who are doing this work to be able to engage with the domain experts and the people who look at rights and obligations. related to this is, for example, the GSMA says that their principle is that the data will remain at all times with the operator. Now, for the whole point of what is going on now is a democratization of data analytics. When I started work on this subject in the 1990s, only people with supercomputers, Cray supercomputers, the National Security Agency and American Express, and people like that could do this kind of analytics. They were being done. Nobody knew about it. I was one of the few people who were writing about it. But today, we can do that with $20,000 of computer hardware. We do it in batch mode. If you are doing it in batch mode, you are able to actually innovate. You can actually come up with new applications and lower cost applications. If you are limited to keeping all the data in the operator's premises, you will not be able to innovate because they don't do batch mode. For them, their computer resource is for running the company. Their key performance indicators are about churn analysis. That is what they use this data for mostly. And then we have to beg and grovel to do public interest research when there is off time on the computers. So the reality of it, if you really want to do third-party research for the public interest, is that people who are making up these rules have to understand what the actual practice of data analysis is. And they have to understand that this is a rapidly changing area, that what we knew 2 years ago is obsolete, and that we now know new ways of handling the data and new models and new ways of improving the quality. The first question that came up was about imposing a property rights frame onto data. I think Stefan was correct. That is to think of data as a thing and to impose an obsolete concept of property onto this. We have seen the damage that has been done in the area of intellectual property by imposing an inappropriate framework of property onto data, onto knowledge. This data stream is all about secondary uses. It's about making valuable insights, extracting valuable insights where none existed before. So when that means you have to think of it as a flow. And if you're, obviously, I agree, there will be value extracted from it. The companies are not going to give it away. It is co-created data, by the way. It's not created by the company or by the operator. It's co-created. So when you have co-creation, you have difficulty with imposing property framework on it anyway. But the entity which has got possession, and we say possession is 9/10, is the operator. They will insist on extracting some of the value. And that will have to be done in terms of royalties or revenue shares, because they don't even know what the value of this thing is today. I'll just give you one example about how this kind of thing plays out. In the city of New York, the city of New York is trying to extract data from their internal systems as well as other information about where people congregate, where there's footfall traffic, so that small businessmen can locate their organizations in the most appropriate places. Because their argument is the big businesses, the Walmarts, all these people are doing it anyway. They've got data analytics. They are locating on the basis of evidence. The small guys are locating on the basis of guesswork. Now, if you put all these restrictions, what you will do is that the Walmarts will continue to do what they do, and the small guys will be deprived of this kind of valuable information to be more competitive and to compete with the big companies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mila, a question for you, maybe, because there was a question about transparency and trust. I mean, UN has a responsibility for a bigger responsibility than most of the actors in the panel, so to speak. How would you say, is transparency enough to guarantee privacy in these issues?
Marcin, and thank you so much for the question. I will first answer this question. I think transparency is not enough. Of course, it is not enough. In addition to transparency, we also need strong security measures, and we also need respect for privacy rights. We also need to consider harms, and we need to understand the risks. And as I noted in my presentation before, understanding risks of using information and also understanding how the rights could be harmed if the data that we want to use is not being used, for example, in an emergency. Coming back to another comment on anonymization, I would like to also add that while we're saying that transparency is not enough, there's certainly a big lack in developing methodologies on anonymization, or at least the same approach, the unified approach to anonymizing big data that is thereafter used for development and humanitarian causes. So there is certainly a big need in researchers, engineers, policymakers, including the UN, practitioners and humanitarian workers to come together and work on this question. And it's not only an issue of anonymization, lack of anonymization, there is also a question of lack of regulatory frameworks. I know that a lot of you have mentioned, and there were a lot of comments with regard to establishing one big regulatory framework. There is a big debate with regard to whether we need a Geneva-type convention on international, for use of personal information, on the right to privacy. I think in order to answer this question and in order to tackle it from the right perspective, I will also echo what Rohan mentioned. We also need not only lawyers participating in this process, but we also need researchers and we need real-time practitioners, those who apply data in the end. Coming back to the point of transparency, for Global Pulse, we established the Privacy Advisory Group, which serves as a transparent mechanism, but also it's an inclusive mechanism. So in addition to transparency, establishing minimum standards for using big data for development and humanitarian purposes, we also need to build awareness. And the Privacy Advisory Group, which is comprised of researchers and engineers, lawyers, as well as humanitarian and development practitioners, is served as the basis for these people to come together and to actually think of the ways of how big data could be utilized properly. When we talk of actually about privacy by itself and understanding what constitutes personal data, in our work, I think in general work for using big data for development, it's very important to understand what is personal data. Currently, internationally, there's no consensus of what is considered private. So I think, or even understanding or definition of privacy. When we talk about establishing minimum standards for anonymization, data aggregation, if you take one country and you transfer data from one country to another, how are we going to determine what constitutes personal data and what regulations should apply to that information if we don't even understand what constitutes personal data in one country versus another? One can say that pseudonymized call detail records are actually constitute personal data, and in a different country, pseudonymized data constitutes non-personal information. And coming back now to the question of linkability. When you work in one jurisdiction where information is not considered personal, you go into another one and you connect it with another data set, if at all, such information may become personal. How do we regulate that? And I think the answer is to explore more frameworks on anonymization, to be indeed more transparent on the practices so the public and those who we're trying to benefit, those who we're trying to protect, are aware of the risks, harms, and also benefits of the big data use. And I think that's a very important component. I would also like to echo what Natasha said during her presentation on the privacy impact assessment. I think it's important when we talk, there is no one answer that fits everything. We need to think of applications of big data and its value on a case-by-case basis. And for these purposes, we need to understand the context. And within the context, we will be able to determine what are the risks and what is the magnitude and the likelihood of the harms that can occur when we're using the data in one country versus another, in one context versus another. And I think performing such assessment before every project is a necessary tool. So I think this is it for me, Marcin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Danilo, I have a question for you, but after when you're done, I think that we have time for one or two more questions, so please prepare a good question to end with. But Danilo, I mean, a lot of these discussions are about regulation, and Brazil has the Marco Civil, What do you see as the biggest benefits or maybe challenges for Marco Civil to actually be used wisely in this territory of discussion?
Marco Civil indeed has a big role on data protection framework in Brazil, but it's not enough. We must remember that Marco Civil in its Article 3 remembers that data protection is a principle of internet use, but must be taken according to the law. But the question is, which law does Marco Civil refers to? We believe that it lacks a general framework on data protection that must be complemented with a general data protection bill, for which Marco Civil is set calls to. I would profit a bit only to make a brief comment on the question by Rodrigo, by the representative of American University, regarding anonymization, anonymous data, and digital fingerprint. It depends on the country, but on the proposed regulation on data protection, you must stress that we try to consider anonymous or pseudonymized data when it can refer to an individual, which is when it becomes a profile of an individual and reflects directly on its life, on its choices. This data must be treated, must be considered as personal data.
Thank you. Questions? More questions? Otherwise, I have questions, of course, but that's boring.
Thank you. I come from India. I am working with Digital Empowerment Foundation. I have a question. Like we are talking about laws and everything, but do you think privacy-enhancing technologies or security-enhancing technologies could be the answer to privacy? Privacy risk.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question?
Privacy-enhancing technologies or security-enhancing technologies could be the answer?
Any takers?
Even now, we have just completed one report where we are looking at different ways in which the data can be shielded from re-identification or de-anonymization, as was stated before. The important thing to remember about de-anonymization is that we have to place it in context. In most of the developing world, where particularly the mobile data is of great value, what we have are prepaid accounts. And I think it's relatively well known that despite the government's enormous efforts trying to associate human beings with the accounts, the failure rate is, I would say, the accuracy is less than 50%, to be generous. Operators in my country have said that they believe that about 70% of the SIMs are used by people other than the people they're registered to. So when you come to that and you're talking about de-anonymization, you have to place that in context. And in many countries, you have multiple data sets, datafied data sets. In many developing countries, you have very few datafied data sets. So while it may be possible to identify somebody using supermarket data and mobile data, that won't be a large number of the population, because a large number of the population does not use supermarkets, and they are not giving credit card information or anything like that, because credit card information use is less than 5%. So we have to place it in context. Now the important thing is that as scientists, we take this as a continuing problem. We don't think it's solved. We don't think it's useful to exaggerate it. We don't think it's useful to take the Netflix case study from the United States and try to impose it and say that it works exactly like that in India. But on the other hand, we think it's a changing field, and we are looking at, for example, seeding the data sets with additional information so that when it's reconverted, it will not reconvert to the original data set. So there's a lot of scientific work being done, and part of what we do is that we follow the ways in which technological means can be used to safeguard against the re-identification problem, which we believe is a real and genuine problem. But it should not be exaggerated.
Thank you. Judisha, remotely. Are you there still? Hopefully.
Yes, I'm here. Yes, thank you. my main observations would be with regard to all the questions that have been asked just right now is that we need to focus on a
So do
very
you hear us, Judisha?
international. Yes, hello. Yes. Hi.
Not really.
Can I speak?
Yes, great. So have you been following the questions as well?
Yes, I have been following all the questions. Yes.
There are many questions about the data protection, basically, when data travels or people travel as well. How do you see your role as a data privacy commissioner, or data protection commissioner, sorry, when it comes to these issues?
Yes, okay. From a regulatory perspective, it's very important that we really understand how to apply the laws on data protection. As Rohan said, it's actually very difficult to apply data protection rules right now in such a difficult and technological context. And really, we need to make laws in a way where everybody is actually involved, like taking from data scientists, all the major relevant stakeholders are involved in making, I would say, sound rules. Not to say that the data protection principles that we have across the world are not sound, but we need to really innovate in the legal sphere because there are many, many issues that we can't tackle with the current existing regulatory frameworks, which are so multifaceted in different parts of the world and so different from each other. So it doesn't make sense, I would say, that we need to apply different rules to perhaps the same data which is going across borders, and different treatment, legal treatment, is being given to this data, which is essentially the same data. So I think this is a very important point, and we need to really focus on how actually we work together and make sure that we are actually implementing a very sound and reasonable rules. So this is my first point. And my second point would be we are actually in a limbo because we have the developing context, we have the underdeveloped world, developing and developed countries. And we have obviously very wide technological gaps, and technological infrastructure is really different from one country to the other. So how do we really keep pace on big data with these technological tools that we have, or technological structures, infrastructures that we have? So are we really giving respect to the data by applying, restrictive technologies or outdated technologies which do not really treat the data the way it should be treated in some contexts, and in other contexts it's being done in a way that it is really good? So we need to really work on these issues and try to see how we can actually work together and make sure that as far as big data is concerned, because it's really big, we are actually helping each other in making sure that we are giving quality to data. So that would be really my 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mila, some concluding remarks maybe?
There are the concluding remarks, but I would like to actually follow up on and clarify that use of aggregated data or use of pseudonymized information, that in our context, in the development and humanitarian context, based on the feasibility study that we've done, as I previously mentioned with the Massachusetts of Technology, I think it's important to understand that not in every case scenario you actually need individual data, individual level data. It depends on, as I said before, it depends on the context. We're looking at community level data. Sometimes it's enough to even have data aggregated by zip code or even municipality. And the assessment of those users needs to be done prior to the project. But it's important to understand that it's not in every case scenario that you will have a specifically unified, identifiable individual. No. Ethics needs to be established to commit to not re-identify that information, and also proper encryption mechanism would have to be used and must be used in order to protect that information when it moves from one location to another. But again, please keep in mind that For development and humanitarian causes, we do not need individual level data, and I think it's an important point to consider when we move forward and talk about big data uses. Thank you.
Thank you. We're actually out of time, which means that we are happy with this discussion. It's so interesting because this is a discussion where many stakeholders meet, apparently, both in the room and in the panel, in the discussions outside of the IGF. And obviously there's a lot of interesting and very competent and diverse questions to still be asked and to be answered as well. I hope that this discussion can continue after the session as well, online, in our stakeholder meetings, in the groups that are connected to this issue. Thank you so much for this time and this session.